You mentioned, and I want to pick up on this point here, you mentioned right before we went to the break that the Catholic Church has spoken against Freemasonry in countless numbers of ways. Let's talk about what the Church says with regard to Freemasonry. I think anybody listening with 2 ears and engaging the brain today, the intellect rather, not the brain, can begin to understand the incompatibility here. We're beginning, I mean, you're so clearly pointing that out to us. But officially, the Church has taken stands on Freemasonry.
That's right, Jeanette. The Church has rarely condemned theological errors more frequently than she has with Freemasonry. We have had 12 separate popes over the last 250 years issue collectively about 24 condemnations of Freemasonry on the grounds that the teachings that the men are learning in the lodge are utterly incompatible with the Catholic faith because they reject or at least hold in doubt divine revelation. And so it's very clear. The most recent condemnation came under the pontificate of John Paul II, written by our future Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger. And Cardinal Ratzinger simply affirmed what the Church had always taught. Not only did that declaration claim that the teachings of Freemasonry are incompatible with the Catholic faith, those teachings and condemnations lightly. Rarely does she go that far. That's how pernicious Freemasonry is, and that's how seriously the Church takes these teachings. It has declared that men who enroll are in a state of grave sin. They must get out. They cannot receive the Eucharist, and our canon law certainly encourages and prohibits them from doing so.
I'm glad you mentioned canon law, because there's confusion about this. And the Code of Canon Law was revised, if you will, not rewritten, but revised, I guess is the appropriate term, in 1983. And with regard to secret societies, the language changed somewhat. And so this has been, if you will, the legal loophole where many have believed that the Church changed her position on Freemasonry because the language changed somewhat. Walk us through that as an attorney, as a lawyer, and explain to us why that is not the case.
Excellent. As a lawyer, I had to deal with this myself, because under the old code, the 1917 Code of Canon Law, it was 2335, there was an express excommunication for any Catholic who joined the lodge.
Stated in the law.
Stated in the law. The new provision, which is 1374, doesn't mention Masons specifically, and it changes the penalty from excommunication to interdict, and we'll talk about that. But the reason why it changed is just for the opposite of what you would think. The reason why the Church didn't mention Masons explicitly is it because it was trying to broaden the law to pull in other groups that promulgated teachings and practices that were harmful to the Church. So, for example, Planned Parenthood, the Ku Klux Klan. There are other groups beside the Masons that are harmful to the Church. And so the Masons weren't singled out. That doesn't mean that the Church changed its position. In fact, the change in the Code of Canon Law was the impetus for Pope John Paul II, with Cardinal Ratzinger's help, to issue that declaration saying, in spite of that change, that doesn't mean things changed. The Church still affirms her position as she always did. So the law was changed to broaden the application. We may also mention, John, that there are other provisions within Code of Canon Law that attach to this issue. For example, if a man would embrace the theology of the lodge, and many unfortunately do, they would be in a state of objective heresy. Now, we're not judging their subjective intentions, but if they would embrace these teachings objectively, they would be heretics. Similarly, a man who would refuse the Holy Father's authority, he can't prevent me from being a Mason, they may find themselves, again, objectively in a state of schism. They've separated from the Holy Father because, again, these are part of the Church's ordinary, infallible teachings, part of our ordinary magisterium, taught always and everywhere, to which Catholics are bound.
As we're sitting on this set today, I'm very aware of the fact that our viewers are with us, our family of viewers right here with us, and I'm thinking there's a lot of people out there saying, John, I just don't get this because I thought I could be a Mason, and here I am. I'm a Catholic, and I'm a Mason, and, I just went through those first 3 degrees, and I didn't attach any significance, and I'm really not all that involved in everything that you're saying here. I really didn't know all this, or I really didn't hear all of this, or somebody else is saying, gee, I have Freemasonry in my background, is this something I should be concerned about? How many people, once they come through those first 3 degrees, gather the amount of information that you have on the lodge? Do they keep going, and what is the deal with that?
Very few men really understand the teachings of Freemasonry. For a number of reasons. One, they've entered into the lodge for business or social reasons. They're not in here really to adhere intentionally here to the religious rituals. They dismiss those. They try to do that. And so that's one reason. The other reason why, Jeanette, is because the rituals are written in a secret ciphered format. Okay, so their intelligibility is not accessible to only to those men who really take the time to transcribe them, and you learn these things through oral tradition. And so that's why most men don't have a clue of what Freemasonry teaches, because the teachings are even concealed from the Masons themselves until they take the initiative. The other thing I would mention is, even if a man claims, well, I don't follow those rituals and I'm just in here to drive the motor cars with the shrine, this is what's important. You've taken an oath. You have bound yourself in an oath to Freemasonry. If that oath means what it says, you have a problem, because you've sworn to God that you would adhere to a moral and religious system that is incompatible with the Catholic faith. If that oath does not mean what it says, then you've just sworn a rash oath, a frivolous oath, and are equally subject to God's judgment. So that's the catch-22 that Catholics must face in regard to these oaths and in making the decision to leave the lodge.
And it's not an easy decision to make, is it?
It's very difficult. I mean, it's the mystery of grace. I don't want to sit up here and judge the subjective intentions of any man. I can only speak of what objectively the lodge teaches and what objectively the church teaches. I mean, that's why I'm here. But it is difficult. It is very difficult. It takes a lot of grace and a lot of prayer to submit yourself to the teachings of the church. She has much more wisdom. We need to follow our fathers in the faith. They've been very clear about this.
We're coming to time for our next break, so I don't want to get into a very big question here that I want to save for the last segment. But I do want to ask you about your exit out and the difficulty that you experienced just in coming to terms with that, and the formality that you used in order to do that.
I wrote a letter. Well, first I called the worshipful master and told him I was resigning, and he thought it was a joke. The reason why I don't believe I received a lot of repercussions that other men have is because I knew so much more about Freemasonry than they did. I think they just thought that I fell off my rocker and became a fanatic, and so they didn't deal with me. But formality is, you write a letter to the Blue Lodge, and then when you terminate your membership in Blue Lodge, that terminates all your affiliated memberships. And so that's really what you have to do. Of course, the next thing you have to do is you have to go to the sacrament of confession and renounce those oaths, because you are bound to those oaths, as we discussed, until the church looses you from them.
Which tells us how very serious this is. And I want to say that very kindly, in the back of your book, Masonry Unmasked, you did include a sample resignation letter. So if there's any of you watching today and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm in deeper than I thought, the good news is that there is help in this book for you to make that initial first step, to break that affiliation, and then obviously the sacrament of reconciliation. We're going to go to that break, and we will be right back to continue this fascinating discussion today. Stay with us. We went to that break, John, and, you know, we were talking about the fact that you came out of Freemasonry, you couldn't reconcile it anymore, your conscience was troubled, you made that break, you went to the sacrament because you had to renounce those oaths that you made. And on our break we were talking about the fact that, you know, whether or not you truly intended those oaths, whether or not you really understood those oaths, in a certain sense, in a spiritual sense, doesn't really matter, because the oaths were made. And so there is an efficacious effect that comes from that reality that's happened. Let's talk for a moment about something that I think, you know, you, our viewers, are clearly seeing here. You know, Freemasonry sets itself up as a parallel religion in so many ways to Roman Catholicism, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's because Freemasonry believes that it has the definitive truth, and we know that the Catholic Church does have the definitive truth, so naturally they're diametrically opposed. That's why as soon as Masonry was conceived, and we trace modern Freemasonry back to 1717, Pope Clement XII immediately condemned it, because they're diametrically opposed institutions. They both claim to have the truth. Only one can have it.
Yeah. When I was doing my research years ago on Freemasonry, I found it almost, I was astonished by the fact that the journal at that time was called New Age. And subsequently to that time period, that title was changed, that name was changed to the Scottish Rite Journal, I think it is, right?
That's correct.
Because of the notoriety of the New Age movement. That was done in 1990. And yet we have to be aware of the fact that there are, even though that change has been made, there certainly are tenets that are put forth by Freemasonry that are very similar to that which we see in the New Age movement. And one of these, overarching tenets has to do with the desire for a one world religion and a one world government. Speak with us about that with regard to Freemasonry.
Well, it's not what I say or you say, it's what Freemasonry has said about itself. If you read, and I've read the periodical, the New Age magazine, and the Scottish Rite Journal, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry has declared that it wants to have a one-world religion ruled by Freemasonry. In fact, the 32nd degree of Freemasonry, which I took, all Scottish Rite members take that, in the ritual itself, it says Masonry will govern the world. One world religion, one world order. And so it's clearly the objective of Freemasonry. Once you deny revelation, God's supernatural revelation, anything goes. And Freemasonry is trying to create its own religion through its symbols, its name for God's name for heaven, all its implements of worship, that it is the true faith.